Anything about that?
No.
No, of course not.
Local cops here are responding to the SOS.
Oh, by golly. Looks like crack cocaine.
The Tacoma Police Department raided over 130 crack houses last year.
Is this the sixth time we've gotten you to crack house?
Oh, no, I haven't been counting.
Haven't been counting.
Drug-related arrests have skyrocketed 100% in this medium-sized city over the past 5 years.
Unfortunately, when we're born, we don't get to decide what we are born into. Although some of us are lucky and have a loving family, others are born into tragedy, heartache, and abuse. We have heard too many stories of children born into homes without any love, who move from foster home to foster home and never find a place where they can be happy. Often, those stories that we hear end in a death or an arrest, but some of them end with no clear explanation or conclusion. In today's episode, we're discussing the case of a missing girl who witnessed tragedy before she was even old enough to form complete sentences. Although every theory in this case tends to point in one direction, this little girl is still missing, and no charges have ever been filed against anyone. By keeping eyes on this case, I'm hoping that we can eventually see someone in custody for this little girl's disappearance, and hopefully find answers for her. On July 20th of 1995, 3-year-old Lenoria Jones became one of the missing. From the very beginning of her life, Lenoria was placed into a multitude of problems. Lenoria was born in January of 1992 with cocaine in her system, and the identity of her father was never known. Because of her drug dependency at birth, Lenoria was never in the custody of her mother, and she spent the first 2 years of her life bouncing between 6 different homes of family members in Spokane, Washington. Lenoria's mother had given up custody of her daughter at birth, but she stayed in touch with her over the years through phone calls. In 1994, Lenoria was a ward of the state, and the decision of her next home placement was between her grandparents in Spokane or her great-aunt in Tacoma. Ultimately, Lenoria was sent to live with her 45-year-old great-aunt, Berlean Williams, in Tacoma. Berlean had 4 children of her own, who were teenagers or adults when Lenoria came to live with them. She also ran a daycare inside of her home, and all of the parents seemed to love her caring for their children. Because of the cocaine in her system at birth, it's reported that Lenoria had a severe case of ADHD, and she was currently on a medication called Norpinephrine. This medicine is an antidepressant that is also prescribed for ADHD, but it's usually not given to children or teenagers because of the severe side effects that it can cause, including seizures, skin rashes, and even death. When I read that Lenoria was on an ADHD medication, I was really surprised that she received such an early diagnosis and medication prescription. One of my daughters is also ADHD, and we knew from about the time she was 3, but an ADHD diagnosis almost never happens earlier than 4 and 5, when the child starts school and really has a problem focusing and sitting still. However, this was also the 90s, when the number of drug-addicted infants was on the rise, and the public began to panic. You might remember seeing the older advertisements about the quote-unquote crack babies that were born, and Lenoria would have been viewed in this way at birth. She was also a little black girl who was born to a drug-addicted mother living in poverty in Tacoma, so it's possible that she was quickly diagnosed and medicine was given early as an intervention. I also wonder why other ADHD medications weren't tried first, because Norpinephrine would have been a fairly new medication at the time. In fact, everything that I read in my research stated that this medicine is not approved for anyone under the age of 18, so I'm not sure why a 3-year-old girl was taking it instead of something else. The only explanation that could even come close to why they were giving her this medicine was because it was considered safer than stimulant medicines at the time. Lenoria lived with her great-aunt Berlean and her 4 adult children in the Hilltop neighborhood of Tacoma, Washington. Specifically, they lived in the 1900 block of South Sheridan Avenue. This area of Hilltop was known throughout the 80s and 90s as being heavily tied with gang activity and the crack epidemic. In the late 80s, the Los Angeles Crips were selling drugs throughout the Hilltop community, and fighting violently with the Cuban drug dealers in that area who had mostly been released from prison by Fidel Castro. In 1989, the United States Army Rangers were involved in a shootout with some of these gang members, and this incident became known as the Ash Street Shootout. After this tragic incident, more neighborhood watch programs were created, the alcohol impact area was created, and the real estate prices were raised. The Hilltop area is now considered much safer than other areas of Washington. However, 32% of the residents are still living in poverty. On July 20th of 1995 at 9:42 a.m., Berlean called the police from the Target store located on South 23rd Street. She told the dispatcher that she had walked into the store with Lenoria to look for a new bathing suit, and when she looked back, Lenoria was gone. The cops quickly arrived and searched for Lenoria, but she was nowhere to be found. After speaking with the management at Target, the police reviewed the security footage from inside of the store, and they discovered that Berlean was completely alone when she entered Target. Lenoria was not with her. The police began to question Berlean on her day, and Berlean insisted that Lenoria had been with her, and that the last time that she had spoken to her was when they were getting out of the car in the parking lot. If this is true, and Lenoria went missing sometime between the parking lot and the inside of the store, that means that Berlean was not holding Lenoria's hand or keeping a careful eye on her. This is the first part that I really have a problem with, especially as the mother of a child with ADHD. Most parents of toddlers know that they have to hold the child's hand because they will easily get distracted by toys in the store or other people they see inside of the store. But this vigilance is heightened when you have a child with ADHD because they simply cannot focus on where you're going or what you're doing. By holding their hand or speaking to them often, it helps keep them focused on why you're in the store and what you're getting. Even if Berlean wasn't holding her hand, I find it really hard to believe that she wouldn't be speaking to her occasionally or looking over her shoulder to make sure that Lenoria was behind her. On top of not knowing where she lost Lenoria along the way, Berlean's story kept changing. First, she said that she had spoken to Lenoria inside of the store when the little girl asked for a toy. But then she changed her mind and said that didn't happen and that Lenoria must have gotten lost sometime in the parking lot. Once, she claimed that Lenoria had disappeared while they were still at home and had simply walked away from the house. Then Berlean claimed that Lenoria was taken by two black men that kidnapped her from their home. And then she explained that Lenoria was in a safe and secret location. The police also discovered that Berlean had visited a convenience store and a car wash before arriving at the Target. While inside the convenience store, Berlean called her daughter at 8:47 a.m. and told her that she didn't know where Lenoria was. This was an hour before her call to 911. So she knew before she even got to the Target that Lenoria was missing. The police also spoke with the dispatcher, who took Berlean's call, and they stated that Berlean seemed very lethargic or bored instead of being emotional and frantic, as you would expect a parent to be when their child is missing. When Lenoria's biological mother received word that Lenoria was missing, she told the police that she had called Berlean 2 days earlier and asked to speak with her daughter, but Berlean refused to allow them to speak. The police needed to figure out the last time that anyone had seen Lenoria, and they discovered that it was on July 16th, 4 days earlier, when the family had attended church. The parishioners of the church remembered speaking to the little girl and said that she seemed happy, healthy, and clean, just like she always did. The police were growing very suspicious of Berlean, and because Lenoria was a ward of the state, they were able to find Berlean in contempt of court for not providing the police with information about the girl's disappearance, and she was placed on house arrest for 4 months. Her daycare was also shut down by the state. The police knew that they needed to search the home and speak with anyone who would have been inside of the home on the days leading up to Lenoria's disappearance. All of Berlean's children defended their mother and stated that they had never been the victim of or witness of abuse by Berlean. They also spoke with all of the parents who trusted Berlean with their children at the in-home daycare, and all of them were confident that Berlean would never abuse a child. She also had no record of arrest or abuse of any kind. There was no evidence in the home of foul play, and Lenoria's mother had moved to Arkansas. All of the other family members, besides Berlean and her family, had been ruled out as possible suspects. There was a sex offender and child killer named Terrapon Adhan who was active at that time in the Tacoma, Washington area, and he had actually kidnapped a girl from the Hilltop neighborhood. However, the police ruled him out, as his youngest victim was 10 years old, and they didn't believe that Terrapin would have victimized a 2-year-old. Terrapin's DNA profile is currently being looked at in the disappearance and murder of Amber Hagerman, who the Amber Alert is named after. Berlean's house arrest was lifted in January of 1996, after the judge stated that Berlean did seem concerned and worried when Lenoria disappeared. The judge also believed that Berlean changed her story so many times due to hostility from the police. Although I think Berlean is a suspicious character, I wouldn't be surprised if Berlean did face hostility at the police interrogations. She was interviewed for over 10 hours the first time, on July 21st, and she had many more interviews after that. She was from an impoverished neighborhood, and she was black during a time when her area of town was in a war with the police. After her release, she moved to the Spokane area to be closer to family. Berlean and her children haven't been interviewed since 1995, and her children have always believed that Lenoria disappeared while shopping that day. In August of 1995, an anonymous tip was left with the police, and this caller had information on the case that hadn't been released to the public. The police have believed for years that this person has the ability to open this case up again and bring Lenoria home, but they just need this person to call them back again. Besides this call, no other developments have happened in Lenoria's case. In February of 2000, a 9-year-old girl named Aisha Degree went missing from Shelby, North Carolina, and 18 months later, her school backpack was found buried on a property 26 miles away from where she disappeared. Inside of the backpack were 3 family pictures, and one of these pictures has Reddit convinced that it is a picture of Lenoria Jones. When you first look at the picture, it does look a lot like her, but the closer I looked, the more differences I found, and I don't think that they are the same person. But this is a huge rabbit hole on Reddit, and I'll post the picture for you to look at and compare for yourself. Even if you do believe they're the same person, I find it hard to believe that a 9-year-old in North Carolina knows a 3-year-old in Washington, and both of them went missing. As it is with many Black missing persons cases, Lenoria's case hasn't received much media attention at all. In fact, most of the articles that you can find on this case only discuss her along with the other Tacoma case of Tika Lewis, who I also covered in a previous episode. There are no interviews to watch or news reports to scrutinize, and I really hope that someone can interview Berlean and her family again soon to see if anything has changed. Whether you believe Berlean was responsible or not, there are many different theories in this case. One is that Berlean abused Lenoria, murdered her, and hid her body. But with so many people in that home at all times, someone would have noticed that Lenoria was being abused. You could also wonder if one of her children did something to Lenoria, but then you still have to wonder how no one else saw anything. Another popular theory in this case is that Lenoria overdosed on her Norpromin medicine, as she had just started taking it days before she disappeared. However, there's no evidence that an overdose occurred. She might still be living somewhere and not even know who she is. You could also believe that Lenoria really did disappear from the Target store parking lot, convenience store, or the family home that day. Others believe that due to Berlean's age, she might have been suffering from early onset dementia or had a stroke or something that happened that day to cause her to act lethargic and not know what happened to Lenoria. I would say that this case might never be solved, but we do have that tip from the anonymous caller, and if they called back just one more time to give the police the information that they need, little Lenoria Jones could be brought home once and for all. Lenoria went missing in July of 1995, and she would be 29 years old today. I was born 1 year before Lenoria, and when I saw that she had an insane love for Barney, it really struck a chord with me. Barney was everything to me as a small kid in the early 90s, and it just speaks to the pure innocence of a little girl like Lenoria. She was a black girl with black hair and brown eyes. Her hair was braided at the time of her disappearance, and she would sometimes go by Noria. She was 3 feet tall and weighed around 40 pounds. She was last reported to be wearing blue or turquoise pants and a black t-shirt with Barney on it. If you have any information about the disappearance of Lenoria Jones, you can call the Tacoma Police Department at 253-798-4721. I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I would love to discuss the possibility